every single, inextricably woven together. It's absolutely inspiring and inspired, I think. And we're at a critical juncture on many of these issues that are in these two little tiny articles that most people just kind of skip over and say, oh yeah, they're there too. But they're critically important today, even as we speak. And hopefully there'll start to be some dots connected to say, wait, these are there for a reason. And it's funny, not funny, it's tragic to me. And I'll just take one little example. With they're locked together. There are people today that say, oh, there's so much of the Constitution that's being violated. I'm going to give them a pass on this one. It's like, really? And for example, the presidential eligibility based upon natural citizenship is a huge issue that nobody talks about. And it should be front and center, and it should blow up. Not literally, don't get me wrong, FBI and CIA and everybody else, but it should disrupt mightily the Democratic National Convention this and the next few days. This issue will disrupt the entire nation, and I have individuals that claim to love the principles we're talking about. They say, oh, I'm going to give them a pass on this. It's just a little thing. Every single piece is critically important. If we leave out even one little piece, based on my assumption that it's going to be okay, what about you coming up with an assumption it's going to be, or you? Pretty soon everybody's nibbled around the edges until it's less than Swiss cheese and it's just a tattered remnant of what it was before. And so every single piece is, and these two little articles, as small as they are and compact and seemingly succinct, as you think about it, every single thing about this is another hinge point. So I think it's really important that we remember that as we look at that. These two articles contain discussions about national debt, about the supreme law of the land, about treaty power, about the oath of office, religious tests. I was prohibited in some states when I was running for a national office that they did not think I was Christian enough. I didn't pass their Christian test. And these are people that claim to love and honor, support, sustain, and want to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And they did that with a religious test. Anyway, whatever. Talk about the ratification of the Constitution, why it is what it is, and incorporate it into this very last little hinge point in the Constitution is they reference the year of the Lord. They brought the Lord into it. Isn't that sneaky? It's a secular document. It doesn't have anything to do with religion. Well, they thought that they would refer to the Lord in it anyway. I mean, it's interesting. So those are the things we're going to talk about. We're going to read first the actual text of these two articles. And again, when we get to the end of it, you may say, okay, are we done? Well, no. So beginning, quotation marks around all of it. Article 6, Clause 1. All debts contracted and engagements entered into before the adoption of this Constitution shall be valid against the United States under this Constitution as under the Confederation. I'm not going to comment because we're going to do that as we break these down. Clause 2, this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. Okay. Clause 3, the senators and representatives before mentioned and the members of the several state legislatures and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and of the several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution, but no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. And we're going on to Article 7, Clause 1. The ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states so ratifying the same. And this was attested to by William Jackson, the secretary, by the way. Oh, I wasn't going to make any commentary. Just one little thing. He was a really crummy secretary. His notes were very, very sparse. And if we had just the record that he had made, there would be a great gap in our understanding of this thought process that went into creating this magnificent Constitution. Fortunately, James Madison pulled his chair and table to the front, and he wrote everything down as though he were the scribe. And his notes on the convention are a magnificent study for those that wish to do so, to see what went on to bringing forth what we have. For example, the idea of unbacked paper money. 16th of August, 1787. Tremendous debate, discussion, and voting that happened. That we ain't going to do it. In fact, it was said that if we did it, it would be as dangerous as the mark of the beast, spoken of in the book of Revelation. I mean, they had these kind of in-depth conversations. So they didn't allow unbacked paper money. Well, have we got that now? Absolutely we do. But it was in contrary to the position the American founders took. Okay, so this was attested to by the Secretary, done in convention by the unanimous consent of the states present. Okay, keep not wanting to make commentary, but I do. Rhode Island never showed up. Okay, New York kind of came in at the last minute with Hamilton coming back after leaving for a while and everything. But the states that were there unanimously said, this is what we want. Well, the states did. Not everybody that was there said that, though. Some interesting nuances and why. All of them important. Some of them in the near term, when we get together again, I hope to be able to talk about. But they're not pertinent to the clauses and articles we're talking about today. Okay, consent of the states present. The 17th day of September in the year of our Lord, 1787, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 12th. In witness thereof, we have hereunto subscribed our names. So the year of our Lord's in there, the year of our independence, all of that's tied together, woven together. These are inextricably part of our heritage. And sometime again in the near future, we've done in the past, we're going to talk about how the birth of the nation and the birth of the Savior were tied together in the minds of those that founded this nation. Really interesting. So do you have a question, comment, or anything? No. Okay. All right. So that's the basis of what we're going to be discussing. And I hope we have time. And if I really hurry, we will. But this issue, you need to start connecting the dots in your mind, because we can't talk at every depth on this thing. So let's begin in order of what we said we were going to discuss. National debts. Okay, here's what George Washington said on debt in his farewell address. He had been president for 8 years. He said, as a very important source of strength and security, cherish public credit. Use it as sparingly as possible by cultivating peace, avoiding likewise the accumulation of debt, not only by shunning occasions of expense, but by vigorous exertions in time of peace to discharge the debts which unavoidable wars may have occasioned, not ungenerously throwing upon posterity the burden which we ourselves ought to bear. So there's so much here. Cherish your credit. Use it sparingly. What is today? Our national debt today, and it will be another $1 trillion in 90 days. Okay? Every 90 days now we're adding $1 trillion in debt. And so, but today it's over $35 trillion of admitted debt. That's the admitted debt. The unfunded liabilities that we say, oh, well, our grandkids will pay for this in the future. We're not putting money away for it. We're not making any plans for it or anything like that, but our grandkids will pay for it. It's unbelievably how over the top that is. Use it sparingly. Cultivate peace. We have not had, I'll have to probably go back and verify a little bit of this, but I don't believe we've had a day of peace in my lifetime. And so you're here I am in the mid-70s, and we haven't had a day of peace. And he's saying that's what happens. If you have war, you have debt. That's a fact of life. Okay, vigorous exertions in time of peace to discharge the debt. Unavoidable wars, throwing ungenerously on the posterity. This is something we need to discuss at depth. Okay, again, George Washington, his 5th annual address to Congress said, no pecuniary, that's monetary, concern or consideration is more urgent than the regular redemption and discharge of the public debt. On none can delay be more injurious, or an economy of time more valuable. No one ever in this nation in a leadership position talks about retiring the public debt. It simply is not on the table anytime. And It won't be unless we get a real change in leadership. Here's Thomas Jefferson. I place economy among the first and most important of Republican virtues, and public debt as the greatest of the dangers to be feared. We should be shaking in our boots right now, people, with what we currently have as the mentality and the debt that's on this nation. He also said the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity under the name of funding is but swindling futurity on a large scale. It's immoral, people, to do what we're doing. Here's a couple of principles I put together, longer statements, but I capsulized them here because it would have taken several pages to read, but we'll just give you the gist of it. He said, if incurring a debt was found to be unavoidable, the nation must, quote, never borrow a dollar without laying a tax in the same instant for paying the interest annually and the principal within a given term. Okay. The add-on little statement at the bottom is that we must repay the debt within 20 years to avoid burdening the posterity the debts incurred by the current generation. They considered a political generation to be 20 years. So in my 20 years in public life, I should never incur a debt that can't be extinguished before I leave that public life. These were principles these men lived by. So we look at the Constitution in Article 6, Clause 1. All debts contracted and engagements entered into before the adoption of this Constitution shall be as valid against the United States under this Constitution as under the Confederation. We're going to have to give a little background story to that in a few moments. The thing that's interesting is these founding fathers were honorable men. And new constitutions are often taken as an opportunity, or, oh, you know, those suckers that were in here before, they were profligate, they were just unwise, they did stupid things, they went into debt, they made commitments we can't keep, and they walk when a new constitution comes in. It's a new formulation of a new government. But our founding fathers did not do that. And we're going to see in the Articles of Confederation, they had the same mentality. These men were honorable to say, we incurred it, we're going to pay it. So let's look at the Articles of Confederation for a minute. This was the first Constitution of the United States. You'll see a little background here momentarily. We're quoting out of Article 8 in this. We're talking about expenses and about general welfare and about the defense and everything, and how that was going to be recovered by the value of the land in the states. Now, I got to tell you, I mean, years and years ago, I raced offshore powerboats out of Marina del Rey. At that time, it was probably the most expensive real estate in the world. An acre was probably $100 million, okay? I don't know, I was not in the market, but it was expensive, I know. If you're in rural Georgia and you have 100 acres, you might be able to buy it for $1,000. I don't know. Probably the Georgians would be offended at that comment. But the fact of the matter is, how do you value land in different states? But that was how they thought they were going to do it in the Articles. So that they're talking now as they were beginning the new nation after it had its declaration made, how they were going to take care of these things going on in Article 9. Okay, the money is to be raised for the service of the United States and to appropriate and apply the same for defraying the public expenses, to borrow money, to emit bills on the credit of the United States. That's what they debated August 6th in 1787 about emitting bills. That's unbacked paper money. Yes, sir. Ma'am.
Okay, friend, Annabella, and so if the idea is to pay down debt, then why do we keep on borrowing more money? If we need to tell the federal government no more, cut unnecessary expenses and say, look, enough. We're going to say no more borrowing money, and you can't borrow more money because it's unnecessary, but I don't know how we can do that.
Well, we do need to have that kind of mentality, and your statement that you just made about we got to get some common sense in this thing is far more intelligent than virtually everybody that sits in office. You may say, I'm just a kid. What do I know? But you're smarter than most of the people that are in office now.
borrowing money, no more supporting other countries. It's just going to help them win trade, and it's going to hold back this other thing right there. But I think that we need to say,
We need a new wisdom to come upon the nation.
yes, I think we need to put in our bodies and say, no more. We cannot borrow any more money. We're done. No, we cannot do this because we're having to
We do, indeed.
yeah, because we don't have any extra expenses, and if that means that we need to let little Canadians raise their own money for these little programs, let the communities come up with ways to fund their own programs. Let the communities.
I agree with you. We need to put people in office that will do that, no question. The problem in the beginning of the country, though, is that we had people that understood that, but they also had other misunderstandings. They didn't have the direct power to tax, and the states were to raise the money to send it to Congress. It didn't often happen. I mean, it came sometimes, but not nearly often enough, and it caused a lot of problems in the Revolution. So they had to have a better solution in the Constitution. We're working toward that. But going on with the articles, in Article 12, they said that they're going to repay them, and anything that was charged against the effort to get freedom in the past was going to be honored. So they came up in Article 12 of the Articles of Confederation that they were going to say, we're going to make good the debts that have been incurred to try and get liberty. So they were honorable clear back then. We'll see how soon this was happening, though. So what happens is this testifies of the good and noble individuals that we had there in the beginning. They were willing to honor their commitments. They looked at their predecessors as having done a good effort, best effort, and still we're going to still have to pay for it. They were really behind the eight ball when they came into writing the new Constitution in 1787, because they had not done a good job of keeping up on their debts under the Articles of Confederation. But they were going to pursue liberty, they were going to establish proper government, and they were going to pay for it. They were not going to kind of slide out from underneath this. Let's talk about the supreme law of the land for a minute. That's next on our list. Well, here's again, quoting out of Article 6, Clause 2, this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, shall be the supreme law of the land. Okay? Supreme law of the land. We're going to talk about that. And then treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. A lot of people have taken this and absolutely gutted our proper government, and they're seeking to further undermine it. And literally, the things that they've brought about by this will destroy the liberty of the entire land. So we'll talk about that in some detail. In fact, probably you'll wonder why we spent so much time on it, but it's really important. So this supremacy clause only grants supremacy in the national government in the area of jurisdiction established within and by the United States Constitution. And we'll use some common sense, we'll use some words of the Founding Fathers to see that it can't be all-encompassing as some people have tried to make it. So it does not create some power to take power not granted within the United States Constitution. There's no catch-all there that says, oh, yeah, they're supreme in all things. Hopefully you'll see that shortly. James Madison was considered the father of the Constitution. As he said earlier, as we began this presentation, he took some meticulous notes during the convention and has a marvelous record that he's captured with that. And he was one of the guys that was the instigator and mover that brought about the convention. So he got that title, Father of the Constitution. So we'll put a few quotations in here. This one came out on the debates about the adoption of the Constitution. You can see at the bottom the references that I put in there generally. Madison said, I'm only going to hit the bolded points, the first couple of lines and the last few, in the interest of time. Does it follow because a power is given to Congress that it is absolute and unlimited? The exercise of the power must be consistent with the object of the delegation. You'll see this a couple more times in the presentation. Fact is that it's got to be within the limits and bounds that make common sense, and it's consistent with what they were trying to achieve. So he said that during the acceptance that he was trying to get Virginia to vote in favor of ratifying the Constitution. In Federalist 45, he said the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution of the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. A lot more to 45th Federalist paper, but it talks about how the federal government got these powers, the states got the rest. You talk at length about that, but that's the fact. They keep saying, no, no, no. It is not all-encompassing and all-supreme. There are limits and bounds that are written right into the Constitution. St. George Tucker, I always introduce him for those that have not met him before as the premier constitutionalist in the nation at the time of the founding. The man was absolutely brilliant. He wrote a great book called View of the Constitution of the United States, published in 1803 during Jefferson's administration. You need to get it. You need to read it. It's an absolutely magnificent book reviewing the Constitution as it was understood by the American founding fathers. And speaking of constitutional limits, he said, it is a written contract. Government was reduced to its elements, its object was defined, its principles ascertained, its powers limited and fixed. Squish, squish, squish. It's only this wide. It ain't bigger than what we said it was, okay? So St. George Tucker, brilliant minds, you need to read him. The Ninth Amendment says basically, if we mentioned somewhere rights, and we failed to mention other rights, you've still got all the rights we didn't mention. So this is not exclusive. And again, we'll in the future be able to talk more about this if we talk about the genesis of the Bill of Rights. If they didn't mention a right, you didn't lose it, which is a legalistic kind of perspective. I always tell people, you know, if I put in my will that I was willing my shotguns and whatever to this and that and the other, and I forgot to put my favorite shotgun in, they said, oh, you left it on purpose. You didn't want to will it to anybody. That, if you excluded it, it was purposely done. They're saying here, even if we left it out, you've still got all your rights. So we kept them whether listed or not. 10th Amendment, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Federal government, you don't have the power if we didn't specifically give it to you. You have to have it listed. If it ain't there, it's not yours. Okay. So another James Madison, the law violating a constitution established by the people would be considered by the judges as null and void. He said this during the convention. So they're discussing what when we write the Constitution, how's this going to be received? And he's saying, hey, judges are going to say, if the people write it and ratify it, the judges will say something that's not in conformance to that will have to be thrown out, okay? Here's I quote a lot of Jefferson and Madison and these Kentucky resolutions that I've got right here that I attribute to Thomas Jefferson. Most people attribute it completely to Thomas Jefferson. They were a collaborative effort between Jefferson and Madison. And so I'm going to make, several comments on this, then you'll see they're interwoven together because these guys were brothers in regards to the limits and bounds of constitutional power. This is out of the Kentucky resolutions. It says that the several states composing the United States of America are not united on the principle of unlimited submission to their general government, but that by a compact is a constitution or a contract, under the style and title of a Constitution of the United States, and of amendments thereto, they constituted a general government for special purposes. So they made a government that had a specific assignment. This is your job, do it. Okay. Delegated to that government certain definite powers, reserving each state to itself the residuary mass of right to their own self-government, and that whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. See, these guys, they put a period, an exclamation point, and multiple of those after every single thing that they did. They tied it down and squished it as small as they could so that there was no misunderstanding. But there's a lot of people that say, I don't care what Madison or Tucker or Jefferson said. The Constitution says it's supreme law of the land, and they interpret and apply it as though it is in all matters, okay? And then I took a little license here and said, oh, please, use the intelligence God gave you and exercise some common sense. Now, there's not a lot of that going on in the world today, but if you stop and gave yourself half a chance, I'm sure there'd be a lot of good reason to start applying that. So I asked, does it mean the general government can dictate the number of children you may have? or the color of shoelaces you may choose to wear, or the vocation you may choose to follow, or your vacation, where you're going to go for that. You're going to camp, you're going to go on a big resort, whatever. Your political belief system, your religion, anything and everything is as expansive as could be thought, because there's no limits of those things that are left to your prerogative. And consequently, the general government cannot dictate any of those things or any of the things not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. Let's go on to the treaty power for a moment. This is a terribly difficult process. We're engaged in unending wars because of this. And I'm going to use a few examples from history to show not only what the founders felt, but how everybody's been sucker punched in the 20th century and beyond about these things. So let's look at treaty power for a few minutes. Article 6, Clause 2, this Constitution and the laws of the United States which be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. Okay, this pursuance thing has to do with following the Constitution, and which shall be made under the authority of the United States. Okay, so all of this is limited and bounded by the Constitution. So this idea that treaties become the supreme law in any and every case is something that we have been, during my entire lifetime for sure, under a very strange belief system. I put in here lies, damned lies, and statistics. And that's Mark Twain when he's young, and when he's older, he felt the same way. He was a curmudgeon when he was young even, I think. And so this is kind of where we put this. And Joseph Goebbels was the chief propaganda minister of the Nazi war machine. And he said, roughly translated, if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. And this lie about treaties being supreme in all things and overriding and even changing the Constitution has been a lie that has been told incessantly during my lifetime. And in fact, from Truman on, I don't know of a single leader in the country that hasn't felt that they had justification for doing what they did based upon some treaty issue. Okay, so that's one of the big lies that are used to destroy our Americanist principles and upon which our liberty and proper government hinge. So the so-called treaty power is how that is being stolen. Okay, the lie is that the United States Constitution can be modified or amended. We can change the Constitution by making a treaty. Did you know that? That's what most of our leadership believes. By amending the Constitution through the treaty process. A total falsehood. We'll address what the founders say here momentarily. But remember, all treaties under this Article 6, made shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. Okay, let's look at what a treaty power is. Let's go and look in Article 2 to begin with. The president has to go out, or doesn't have to, but he has the authority to go out and engage in treaty process with other nations. Right out of Article 2, Section 2, he, referring to the president, shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. So a treaty can be created if the president goes out and negotiates it, brings it back, and 2/3 of the Senate agree. Have we changed the Constitution? We hope you'll understand clearly when we get done that that is an absolute falsehood in spite of the people in high places telling you otherwise. But that's nevertheless how treaties happen. President negotiates, the Senate then ratifies or not with 2/3 vote. Okay, so in Article 5 of the Constitution, it says this is how you change your Constitution. Okay, 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of all states have to agree to any change. Now, you read just moments ago, the president negotiates, and then 2/3 of one house signs on to a treaty. The other house is left out completely, and the people are left out when you've got to get 3/4 of the states to agree to those changes. It's a very, very narrow scope of approval. And to say that the president and 2/3 of the Senate can change it completely violates the principle under which it may be changed. We'll talk about what Washington said about that shortly. Okay, so 2/3 of both houses agree, 3/4 agree, and then you understand Congress can't make a change without the concurrence of the people through that 3/4. Okay? When the Declaration of Independence, it says it's the right of the people to alter or abolish their government. That has never gone away. We can alter and abolish our government. We have processes by which that may be done. We may change it through a amendment process that is clearly defined in the United States Constitution. You can change it a lot of other ways by violent overthrow or ignoring or whatever, but they don't follow the constitutional process. You're going to see shortly that Washington frowned on that. But the fact of the matter is that the people have the right to change. That was preserved as the Constitution was brought forth in Article 5. And so the people can change their government, and there's a way to do that peaceably. Okay, but it isn't by changing it with the president agreeing to it and then 2/3 of the Senate agreeing to it. Poorly understood. Because the people would be left out of that other process if we did that one. Okay? So here's what Washington said in his farewell address. 8 years in the office of president. He gave some fatherly, grandfatherly, whatever kind of advice you want, a friend of the people, about how do we keep this great blessing of liberty that we were bequeathed at such great cost. He said the basis of our political systems is the right of the people to make and alter their constitutions of government. But the Constitution, which at any time exists until changed by an authentic act, changed by an explicit and authentic act of the whole people, is sacredly obligatory upon all. The authentic act is defined in Article 5. The treaty power does not have the power to change that document. Okay. He went on to say, if in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, the wrong is in bold and underlined with my emphasis, because you got to come up with where it's wrong. And we've presented before to this group the fact that these people that want to rewrite our Constitution are saying, oh, we got to change the Constitution. Well, why? Well, we got a big debt and we've got this and that and the other. Said, no. Tell me where the Constitution is at fault for this. There is no fault. It's that we've ceased to apply it. But so Washington he covered that. He says, if it's wrong, then, change it in the way the Constitution designates. But let there be no change by usurpation, which is generally what happens. And he says that's the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. So he warned us against what's going on constantly in our government today. The big deficits have nothing whatsoever to do with a misapplication or an inappropriate, wrong application of the Constitution, other than the fact that they're doing what they are prohibited from doing in the Constitution. Again, getting back to St. George Tucker and his view of the Constitution of the United States. That's his great book, 1803. Get it and read it. Cheer all the way through it. Have fun with it. Underline, cross-reference, because it's very well written. He said, let it be supposed, for example, that the President and Senate should stipulate by treaty with any foreign power that in the case of war between that nation and any other, the United States should immediately declare against that nation. Can it be supposed that such a treaty would be so far the law of the land as to take from the House of Representatives their constitutional right to deliberate on the expediency or inexpediency of such a declaration of war and to determine and act thereon according to their judgment? This is 120 plus years ago. 220 plus years ago he published this. He said, you guys are nuts if you think you can make a treaty that's going to take us into war automatically. They foresaw this kind of stuff, but we're going to talk about what's happened during my lifetime. Well, many of your lifetimes too. This is a picture of the United Nations headquarters in New York and the flag. and this is truly planned tyranny. It, in some ways, superficially reflects what might, by the ignorant and unwashed, be considered a similar reflection of the constitutional authority in its charter. But it is nothing at all similar. It is a usurpation. It will bring about tyranny. And it is something that if we follow into it, we will become a nation that no longer has a constitution. The first run at this was made right after World War I with the League of Nations and Edward Mandell House. You'll hear more about him in a moment or two. but they were attempting to get a treaty signed after the World War I called the Versailles Treaty. Woven into that treaty was a League of Nations. And it was a trickery. And you're going to see one of the guys that was the Secretary of State of Dwight Eisenhower was very much involved in that trickery. But anyway, the thing was that if we ratified that, it would have said, we accept the League of Nations as a global government. And the thought was, oh, World War I was so horrid. Everybody wants it done. If we don't ratify this treaty, the war's going to go on. We don't want that, so just ratify it. Well, the Senate wouldn't. And so there's been a concerted effort. The United Nations was the follow-on effort, and it has been going on since it was ratified in 1945. Okay? We'll talk about how this works shortly. I want you to look at just some segments of the charter. It's quite a large charter and a long document. We're only going to cover a few lines in it. In Chapter 8, Article 52, number 1 says, nothing in the present charter precludes the existence of regional arrangements. Tuck that little term aside. We are in a war right now with a regional arrangement. Okay? So, and it's written right in the Constitution, into the United Nations Charter. Regional arrangements or agencies for dealing with matters relating to the maintenance of international peace and security as are appropriate for regional action, provided that such arrangements are consistent with the global government's purposes and principles of the United Nations. I threw in that part, okay? Are consistent with the purposes and principles of the United Nations. This is a global government in formula. And so these regional arrangements can only do things that conform to the purposes of the United States. It says it right there in the charter, okay? We're going to go on and read in Article 53. The Security Council, which is kind of the overriding Supreme Council, if you will, over and above what we'd say is the general body of the United Nations. The Security Council shall, where appropriate, utilize such regional arrangements, and we're going to find out about these guys shortly, or agencies for enforcement action under its authority. But no enforcement action shall be taken under regional arrangements or by regional agencies without the authorization of the Security Council. So we have a globally, well, what shall I call it? It's a global government wannabe that's going to have to authorize everything that is taken by these regional arrangements. Okay, we're right now in war under that regional arrangement, right now, even as we speak. They're trying to draw us into more. Well, let's talk about the NATO treaty for a moment. It was signed in April of 1949. It says the parties to this treaty reaffirm their faith in the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Okay, so the people that signed on to this, originally there was only a handful of nations, now it's 30 nations, but we agree with the Charter of the United Nations, which just said we can use regional authority to wage war against other areas. Okay, Article 1. The parties undertake as set forth in the Charter of the United Nations, but referring it right into, to settle any international dispute and to refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force in any matter inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. Again, a global government wannabe. Let's look at Article 5 under that. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. And consequently, they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith such actions as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force. So if one of the members of the NATO organization gets attacked, we all come to their rescue, okay? Now you're going to see that the strong arm, the big boy, the big brother, whatever you want to call him, in NATO is the United States. We are the enforcement arm of NATO. And you'll see some countries that have less than 1,500 military members. Okay, so they're going to come to our rescue, by golly, if we get into any trouble, folks. Nope, we're there. If somebody bumps into them, we come in and beat up whoever bumped into them. We'll see how this worked a number of times in the world and why the founders warned us against it. Okay, so we're supposed to take violent action against anybody that imposes anything upon any member of the NATO group. Okay, so going on, and this is out of the handbook, it said the signatory countries undertake in conformity with the terms of the United Nations Charter. This treaty is an agreement between certain countries for their collective self-defense as provided for in the Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations. It is a treaty of alliance within the framework of the Charter of the United Nations. Okay, so again, I said there was just a handful. There was only 12 countries to begin with. You can see the countries there, and the United States is listed last. You'll note, they are kind of North Atlantic kind of countries close by and everything anyway. So there were 12 founding members. But over the years, they've added up to 30 countries. And we're going to go through very briefly what years at Turkey, Greece, and Germany, and Spain. These kind of dribbed and drabbed in. And then in 1999, they added Czech Republic and Hungary and Poland. And by the way, let me go back to that one. What happened in the early 1990s? Russia came to the United States and said, we are going to disband the Iron Curtain, basically. The Warsaw Pact ain't going to be no more. You guys have said you have armed and NATO countries to the teeth, and you have said we are going to oppose this Eastern Bloc group, the Warsaw Pact. In 1990, they came to the United States and said, we're disbanding that. We'll do it on the one condition that you agree to never advance the NATO pact 1 inch closer to the western border of Russia. Now, you guys have got a pretty good buffer zone between us and you now. If you agree, we'll disband the Warsaw Pact and we can all go forward. And we'll feel comfortable you're not going to be able to roll across all those countries and get to us quickly. The United States said, good, we're good to go. Wait a minute. In 1999, we're doing the Czech Republic and Hungary and Poland. What you're going to find, if you kind of have your little map in your mind as you look at this, that we have advanced to the very border of Russia, with the exception of Ukraine. Okay? Every country has been gobbled up by NATO by these agreements that we're talking about right now, since we agreed not to advance 1 inch closer. Yes, ma'am? Well, Crimea was Russian to begin with, and it's part of Ukraine, and that's why the Ukrainians want us in there to go be the big brother to beat Russia up. And the founding fathers said, more than heck no, ain't going to do that. In 2017, I was in Washington, D.C. I stood in the peanut gallery in Congress and watched the Ukraine plea to get into the NATO, so we'd be their big brother. Russia has been invaded from the West so many times, they're really sensitive to that. And so we have brought it right to their doorstep. And that's what Ukraine is all about right now. They said, we will not allow another country to be gobbled up by NATO in violation of the agreement that happened. Of course, we had a coup in 2014 that we put a pro-Washington country leadership in Ukraine. And there's a lot of other things, like a lot of other reasons why we're in Ukraine right now, that we've actually spent more American dollars in Ukraine for that conflict than Russia has in their entire annual defense budget for their whole entire nation. We have sunk more money in that, and nothing's happened good there. Anyway, 1999, we kept marching forward and forward and forward. And then in 2003, we added Latvia, Estonia, Slovakia, Lithuania, Slavonia, Bulgaria, and Romania. And then in 2009, we added Albania and Croatia. And then in 2017, want to go back?
Was that again, 96-0? Totally.
Oh, I thank you for bringing that to my attention. It was an overwhelming squeaker. Everybody was in favor of it. And I mean, everybody said, okay, now let me just ask you. If Estonia ever gets attacked, or Latvia, are they going to be there for our defense, or are we there for their defense? Now, use your mind.
They're smaller than Utah.
And they have smaller armies than Utah does, okay? So this is an absolute travesty. The only reason we're there is to be the tripwire to set off a conflagration if something happens. We are their guarantee, and we're guarantee it with American blood, fortune, and sacred honor, okay? So then we go in 2009, Albania and Croatia, another couple of big players in the world events. And then Montenegro in 2017 and North Macedonia. I mean, they argue about the name of this place, let alone where it is. I mean, no, they know where it is. Okay, but that's only 4 years ago. But there's others that are currently, Bosnia-Herzegovina. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes, about how that's where World War I started. Entangling alliance program that went south. Bosnia-Herzegovina. We're there in war right now. And it was done by the United Nations behest under NATO. Still there. Georgia and Ukraine. Okay. Ukraine's been trying to get in NATO for nearly 20 years. Remember the term Membership Action Plan, MAP, okay, because I'm going to use it in a minute and I'm not going to spell it out again. Okay, so in April of 2021, Ukraine Minister of Defense stated that he needed to get the political leadership of Ukraine into a membership action plan in the North American Alliance in 2021. So they said, we're getting in 2021. That was 3 years ago. If we were there now, if they were in NATO 3 years ago, this slide right here would be very, very, very much more on our plate. Ukraine and Russia are engaged in hostile activities in a shooting war that's been limited to their countries thus far. Every effort is being made to expand it, along with the effort to expand anything that's happening in Israel and violence that we're going to be involved in. So, Russian Putin, I don't know how many of you saw the Tucker Carlson interview with Putin. Very insightful. I wished I'd been there to ask one question. And I think I could have phrased it in a way that Putin wouldn't have had an easy way to squeak out from underneath. But I would have asked Putin, if I had been sitting there in that chair, Mr. Putin, you have a lot of intelligence sources, I'm confident, that report to you. And you have some perspectives, I think, that have been derived from those intelligence sources. And I'm wondering if you could share with us your country's perspective as to why the United States is so engaged in Ukraine. And I think that Putin would have probably said, well, you guys have intelligence sources too. I think you ought to ask your people. And I would have had a response saying, that's true. And we have been trying to ask for that. But you have sources that I believe are worthy of our consideration. Why are you thinking that we're there? It would have been so insightful. Yes, ma'am.
Why are we trying to help the people of Ukraine when we should be helping ourselves with our own problems? And like they're trying to help Ukraine. But when we have so much debt, I would like to see the debt go down, not up.
Well, you've got an interesting and exciting and honest point that our leadership can't seem to grasp. But Ukraine and Russia are currently in a shooting war. And if they were in NATO, we would be in a shooting war, according to Article 5 of the NATO agreement. We and Russia would be in an international conflagration that is currently growing at a faster rate than anything that's been a nuclear threat, excuse me, since the middle of October in 1962. We have never been closer to a nuclear war than those days that I remember seeing Jack Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, many of you. Okay. Okay, questions are not being heard on the people online, so let's save them to the end and we'll try and address them then if we can. Okay, so we keep expanding the types of weapons we're given to Ukraine. We expand the means by which they may be used. We've told them you can use it beyond the borders of your current war. And you need to understand that Russia looks at this as an aggression that we are facilitating. If somebody launches something distant from the Ukraine border against a Russian target, that has to be done with U.S. facilitation. Satellite intelligence at least has to be shared. We have refueling issues that have to be, there's other logistical issues. We need to understand that Russia is seeing we are expanding way beyond what we said we'd do in 1990 to their very doorstep, and now we are waging a surrogate war against them. And they said, we're drawing a line in the sand. We are not going to allow Ukraine. We will occupy Ukraine if we have to. Okay, so there's so much more that could be said, but you can see how this is happening now. We mentioned Bosnia-Herzegovina. Okay, let's just go back in the 1990s again. Oh, the old Yugoslavia got broken up. Okay, the United Nations got involved in all of this fragmentation of Yugoslavia. We're going to sort this out. We got ethnic things, we got religious things, we got antipathies that go back 2,000 years, not quite, about 1,500 years. I mean, literally, there's people that are mad that have been that way for generations in Yugoslavia. United Nations got involved. They really fouled it up. So they said, NATO is a regional arrangement under the United Nations. We can direct that military arm to come in and take over this operation. Guess who's the big backbone of that? That's the United States. So we got pulled into Bosnia by a regional arrangement under the United Nations because of the United Nations Treaty and the NATO Treaty. Okay? We're still there. Okay, we're going to find out. This is where World War I started. And they want to be in NATO now. Okay, we'll get to that shortly. Okay, so just a recap. NATO is a child of the United Nations, a regional arrangement. It's a military arm of the United Nations, and the United States is the enforcer. So you can see how we have been sucker punched deeper and deeper and deeper into what could be something that's totally unrelated to anything that we have any interest in. And you'll see that's kind of what happened in World War I shortly. Oh, there's another one out there. Some of you may have heard of SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. It's another UN authorized. As I put this together, I thought unauthorized regional. Oh, yeah, well, that's the most correct term, but it's a UN authorized regional arrangement. We went into Vietnam to fulfill a SEATO agreement. That's what took us into Southeast Asia. We went there, 58,000 of my generation died, hundreds of thousands were maimed, millions of Vietnamese were killed, and you're going to see in a minute what John F. Kennedy said about Southeast Asia. And this was the mentality that was going forward. Kennedy made this statement that we'll get to in just a minute, and while he was a senator, before he was president. I will parenthetically remark that Eisenhower sucked us in deeper into Southeast Asia. And with his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and his CIA Director, Allen Dulles, brothers, no less. Yeah, go figure, how'd that happen? Wow, they were both involved with Woodrow Wilson, okay? Anyway, and then with another, I can hardly even say the name without spitting it out. It's Robert McNamara, and they did this. He wrote a book years later called In Retrospect. Well, in retrospect, as I pontificate from my easy chair about how we got into Vietnam, he engineered and brought about that whole mess, and then LBJ carried it forth. But that's another story. Kennedy was trying to extract the United States. What actually happened, in the beginnings of his administration, he puts a few more thousand American advisors in there. But then he asked a question. They're not in combat, are they? Have any Americans been killed? And the number came back and they said, yeah, so far 75 have. 75? Are you kidding me? Let's get those guys out of there. And his approach was to begin extraction a month after he was assassinated. Of course, he didn't know he was going to be assassinated in November of 1963, because we're in the 2020s now and I keep leaving the 19s out. But he was going to start extracting them and have them all out by the end of 64. That was his plan. The warmongers in this nation did not want that to happen. And there was a lot of things, I think, that went into his assassination that had to enter into it. But there was a lot of other things of involvement. Not enough time to discuss it in our current setting, and our time is fleeting us when we've only got 175 slides left to go. Okay, so anyway, a little quick math in my mind tells me I'm in big trouble. Okay, but the one thing that just we never understood. Why did the enemy in Southeast Asia always seem to know about any operation that was of any size and nature before even the troops on the ground knew about it, because we were telling the United Nations Security Council in advance everything that was happening. And they were filtering that to North Vietnam through Russia, okay? People died because of this agreement. I have in my files letters that state we were informing them of every operation. I don't know how many of my friends died because of that, but it's tragic. Okay, here's a Kennedy about how we played this international favoritism, and it flawed our national policies with this blind devotion. And you should know, if you don't already, the other day when I was in the hospital, I asked one of the nurses that was, the conversation led up to, you don't have time for, but I had a couple of references to some historical things, and the nurse had this deer in the headlight look, and I said, do you know the name Ho Chi Minh? No. How about Chiang Kai-shek? No. How about Che Guevara? No. Never mind. Anyway, so we just don't teach that anymore. But at any rate, that's tragic because the past is prologue. What's happening in the future can be foretold by what we've had in the past. I'm quoting JFK. This is when he was senator. So he was not president at the time, and as I mentioned, he was trying and ultimately going to try and extract us from Southeast Asia. But this is the mentality in the 1950s. Why in the 1950s? It has to do with French colonialism. It has to do with Ho Chi Minh and how he wanted to align himself with the United States and get unaligned with the French colonialism and all this kind of, I mean, this stuff, I can't make this up. It's phenomenal. But because we were aligned with the French and because the Dien Phu had happened and because Ho Chi Minh had started to align himself with the communist philosophies, and he was very much a communist, no question about it. Kennedy said, Vietnam represents a test of American responsibility and determination in Asia. If we are not the parents of little Vietnam, wait a minute, how do we father a country? I don't know, who was the mother? I mean, okay, never mind. I can't. Anyway, this is the philosophy that we had. If we're not the parents of little Vietnam, then surely we're the godparents. He was a Catholic, remember. We presided at its birth. We gave assistance to its life. We have helped it shape its future. As French influence in the political, economic, and military spheres has declined in Vietnam, American influence has steadily grown. How about that? The CIA was involved in that too. Anyway, this is our offspring. We cannot abandon it. We cannot ignore its needs. And if it falls victim to any of the perils that threaten its existence, communism, political anarchy, poverty, and the rest, then the United States, with some justification, will be held responsible, and our prestige in Asia will sink to a new low. Robert McNamara and LBJ engineered a total disaster out of that thing, far exceeding the disaster that happened with the Biden mess in Afghanistan. I mean, it lasted years longer. I mean, in terms of the total collapse. Okay, so here's some of our current entangling alliances. Korea, Katanga, that's in Africa, by the way, Southeast Asia, Bosnia, Iraq I, Iraq II, the wars that happened there, Afghanistan, all violate the United States Constitution. We currently have a presence of in 130 nations. We're the tripwires that are there just in case somebody decides they're going to stumble over us and offend somebody else. Okay, our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor are all at stake. Let's talk about the run-up to World War I. Okay, just for a little historical background, because that nurse that was in the hospital may still be here tonight. But at any rate, October of 1908, Bosnia and Herzegovina, where did we hear that before? They're trying to get into NATO right now, aren't they? Okay, was annexed by Austria. The Serbs were ticked off because they had designs on Bosnia and Herzegovina. And in June of 1914, the Archduke of Austria, who was the heir to the throne, he visits Bosnia and Herzegovina with his wife, Sophie. It's a story there. It's a love story. It really is. She's pregnant with one of their children. And she was a commoner, couldn't ride with him in a car in Austria because he was royalty. He took her there so they could drive with her on their anniversary. This is the backstory on that. So he went there to review the country that was now part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Okay, so the entangling alliances drove the international relations in those days. Here's a picture of, partial picture of his family. He and his wife were targeted by Serbian agents. They were part of a group called the Black Hand. It is a secret combination. That is a term that was coined by the American founding fathers, used in many of our heritage. And this Black Hand, this secret combination, was aligned with a portion of the Serbian government. So here's an artist's depiction of the murder that occurred of the Archduke and his wife in June of 1914. Now here's where the entangling alliances that we were warned so emphatically and passionately against by the American founding fathers. Austria, because the Serbs had a connection on this thing, Austria lost their crown prince, if you will, and they declared war against Serbia. Serbia had an ally in Russia who declared war against Austria. Austria had an ally in Germany, and they declared war against Russia. Russia declared war against Turkey because they were Germany's ally. And then Great Britain and France, Russia's allies, declared war against Turkey. And pretty soon the whole civilization was in a conflagration of war. Tens of millions of people were murdered in that thing over the murder of the Archduke and his wife. But it was because of these entangling alliances. Well, why did the United States get involved? Well, there was absolutely no reason except for the big financial houses, the big Wall Street houses, invested in the war. And it looked like their investments were going to go south. See, if you lose a war, you don't pay your debts back, you know. And they were pretty panicked. So they were pushing for this with Woodrow Wilson and his alter ego, Edward Mandell House. And they wanted to do more than that. They wanted a globalist socialist government established. And so what has been discovered by some of the peace organizations like the Carnegie Peace Foundation, that war is the fastest, most effective method to permanently unseat a nation's values, attitudes, and beliefs, their mores. And so the United States needed to come into this to protect economic, to set up a scenario where global government could be put in and how they could rid themselves of the Americanist philosophy that had kept us the greatest, freest, strongest, most happy, most prosperous nation on earth. So let's go back and look and see what the founding fathers said. Here's what George Washington said in his farewell address about going over to a foreign nation and going to war. He said, "Why forego the advantages of so peculiar a situation? Why quit our own to stand upon foreign ground? Why, by interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, interest, humor, or caprice?" I mean, he squeezed it down again. This is where we're coming from. Thomas Jefferson, he also counseled against these alliances. He said, "I have ever deemed it fundamental for the United States never to take part in the quarrels of Europe. Their political interests are entirely distinct from ours. Their mutual jealousies, their balance of power, their complicated alliances, their forms and principles of government are all foreign to us. They are nations of eternal war." I mean, this stuff goes back to the Middle Ages. I mean, this Bosnia-Herzegovina thing, it really, truly does. John Quincy Adams, son of Abigail and John Adams, this man was born and bred to diplomacy and statesmanship. He said, let's not go to war with other nations. Here's one thing he said: America has abstained from interference in the concerns of others, even when the conflict has been for principles to which she clings. She goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. Israel's? No. Ukraine's? No. How about France? Germany? Pick a country, any country. No. That is not the Americanist philosophy. So the Monroe Doctrine formalized this philosophy, and some of the greatest statesmen that have walked on this, at least on this continent anyway, maybe in the world, we're a non-interventionist country. Here's three guys who were involved in what they call the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe's the guy in the top left-hand corner, and then we have Adams and James Madison on the bottom. And this is a capture of the philosophy of it. In the wars of European powers in matters relating to themselves, we have never taken any part, nor does it comport with our policy so to do. Our policy in regard to Europe is not to interfere in the internal concerns of any of its powers. That was our philosophy until Woodrow Wilson came on board. Well, there was some idiots that got involved along the way and intervened in a lot of things, but it was the general policy of the nation. So here's what Thomas Jefferson says on treaty power. This thing about the supreme law of the land, and just the underlined and bolded part. It must have meant to accept out of these the rights reserved to the states, for surely the President and Senate cannot do by treaty what the whole government is interdicted from doing in any way. He went on to say, our peculiar security is the possession of a written constitution. Let us not make it a blank paper by construction. So let's not start interpreting it any way we want just so we can say it really says this. I say the same as the opinion of those who consider the grant of the treaty-making power is boundless. If it is, then we have no constitution. If it's as wide and broad as Eisenhower tried to make it be, or Truman, or Trump, or whoops, or Obama, or any of these other guys, okay, then we don't have a constitution. You can't let them nibble away at little things that you think are insignificant. It's got to be all there, or we're in real trouble. Here's Madison. Does it follow because this power, treaty power, it's what he was talking about, is given to Congress that is absolute and unlimited? Again, we're going to skip some in the interest of time. The exercise of the power must be consistent with the object of the delegation. You can't change the Constitution. You can't destroy the declaration of war process. It's an established process. You can't do that. You limit it to what it was intended to be. I'm going to have to really hurry through this portion because I've got a lot of slides, but honestly, I'll maybe read a lot of them quickly because you'll cheer all the way through this decision. This is a 67-year-old Supreme Court decision that affirms the wisdom of our American founding fathers and the position we've tried to take through this presentation. It happened in 1957. It was a Reed v. Covert. You can go look it up. I'll give you the reference here on the next slide. It was one of the things that Earl Warren did right while he was the Supreme Court Chief Justice. Okay, you can see his associates also. What happened was they made a really, really, really stupid decision in 1956. It was totally wrong. And then they thought about it. And then they said, holy cow, what have we just done? So they said to the guy that had brought it, could you bring that back and we'll get another shot at this? And he did. So it was re-argued in 57. It was decided in June of 57. Okay. And basically, it's legal history. This guy that argued it, it was the first time that any lawyer had lost in front of the Supreme Court and won on a rehearing, because they said, please bring it back. We'll rethink this. They messed up big time. Okay, so it's a landmark Supreme Court case that ruled that the United States Constitution supersedes international treaties ratified by the United States Senate. Okay, so and you'll see in a minute that initially it started out as an agreement that they were arguing. And they answered that issue, and then they expanded it. It says this doesn't just apply to agreements. It applies to treaties also. So it keeps getting bigger, bigger, bigger the more they talk. And it gets better the more they talk. So, boy. Maybe in a minute. Probably would make my mouth fizz and I'd look like I was a foaming dog or whatever. At any rate. So treaties do not override the Constitution. And this was the outcome of it. And this was an executive agreement they were arguing, not a treaty, but let's go through the quotations. No agreement, that's all-encompassing, whether it's a treaty or an executive agreement, with a foreign nation can confer on Congress or any one other branch of the government power which is free from the restraint of the Constitution. When the United States acts against its citizens abroad, it can only do so in accordance with all the limitations imposed by the Constitution, including Article 3, Section 2, and the 5th and 6th Amendments. The power of the Congress under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 14 of the Constitution. I remember back in, memory banks, I have this, I'm sure. Look at it. Oh, there it is. Okay. This has to do with the rules that are made by Congress for the military, Clause 14. To make rules for the government and regulation of land and naval forces, taken in conjunction with the necessary and proper clause, does not extend to civilians, even though they may be dependents living with servicemen on a military base, which happened to be the case of the woman that was charged under this agreement because she was living on a base with her husband until some inappropriate things happened. Anyway, I'm not going to argue the case in front of you, but they said, under our Constitution, courts of law alone are given power to try civilians for their offenses against the United States. People, understand this clearly. This should be a stake in the ground. Those people that believe that military tribunals are currently being used right now to arrest American civilians, try them and execute them, are violating the baseline American principle of civilian governance. And those that believe that, if that's really happening, we have bigger problems in this nation than any of us can possibly imagine. But that is a strongly held position by many in the country today. Okay, enough said about that, and we could do a whole presentation about that. But courts of law are given power to try civilians. That's it, not military tribunals, okay? Going back, we reject the idea that when the United States acts against citizens abroad, it can do so free of the Bill of Rights. United States, these are all quotations. I'm not making this up. You'll just look at this and say, oh, there's a quote mark in the quote. Yep, it's all quotations. The United States is entirely a creature of the Constitution. Its power and authority have no other source. It can only act in accordance with all the limitations imposed by the Constitution. When the government reaches out to punish a citizen who is abroad, the shield which the Bill of Rights and other parts of the Constitution provide to protect his life and liberty should not be stripped away just because he happens to be in another land. This goes into the CIA's, dark sites that they rendered some people and tortured them, American citizens, after the Bush administration implemented those kinds of things. Or January 6th. They're not even out of the country. They're in the country. All of these kinds of things are in total violation of what the baseline principles are, and nobody's following them. You're going to find out that a nation cannot be ignorant and free, and we are very ignorant. This court and other federal courts have held or asserted that various constitutional limits apply to the government when it acts outside the continent of the United States, while it has been suggested that only those constitutional rights which are fundamental protect Americans abroad. Their quotes were in their statement too. We can find no warrant, in logic or otherwise, for picking and choosing among the remarkable collection of thou shalt nots, which are explicitly fastened on all departments and agencies of the federal government by the Constitution and its amendments. Moreover, in view of our heritage and the history of the adoption of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, it seems particularly anomalous to say that trial before a civilian judge and by an independent jury picked from the common citizenry is not a fundamental right. You can't have military tribunals doing this and not have violated the Constitution in a degree that maybe we can't fix if this is happening to the degree that some people claim it is. At the time of Mrs. Covert's, now that's the woman that was charged in this, that was the American wife, alleged offense, an executive agreement was in effect between the United States and Great Britain, which permitted the United States military courts, military tribunal, to exercise exclusive jurisdiction over offenses committed in Great Britain by the American servicemen or their dependents. The obvious and decisive answer to this, of course, is that no agreement with a foreign nation can confer power on the Congress or any other branch of government which is free from the restraints of the Constitution. Article 6 of the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution declares, quoting, this is, again, quoted out of the Reed v. Covert case. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, they're quoting the Constitution. Could you believe the Supreme Court actually looks back and try? I mean, this is such an anomaly, like I said. Which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. There is nothing in this language which intimates that treaties and laws enacted pursuant to them do not have to comply with the provisions of the Constitution. Nor is there anything in the debates which accompanied the drafting and ratification of the Constitution which even suggests such a result. It would be manifestly contrary to the objectives of those who created the Constitution, as well as those who are responsible for the Bill of Rights, let alone alien to our entire constitutional history and tradition. See, this is a big long run-on sentence because they're really excited. You have to kind of hyperventilate a little bit. To construe Article 6 as permitting the United States to exercise power under an international agreement without observing constitutional prohibitions. In effect, such construction would permit amendment of that document in a manner not sanctioned by Article 5. That's where we define the changing your government process, 2/3 of both houses, 3/4 of the states, that kind of stuff. Okay, we talked about that. The prohibitions of the Constitution were designed to apply to all branches of the national government, and they cannot be nullified by the executive or by the executive and the Senate combined. So the treaty process, the executive negotiates, the Senate ratifies, can't do it, can't do it. And then they quote an older case that was in 1890, and they quote out of that. I won't take the time to read it too, but it forbids this to be changed by these kinds of things. Going on, though, they're back into the Reed v. Covert itself, but they included that statement about that 1890 Supreme Court ruling in their ruling in 1957. There was nothing new or unique about what we say here. This court has regularly and uniformly recognized the supremacy of the Constitution over a treaty. Now, did I just say that? And they reinforced it, or did they say it before and I reinforced it? Whatever. It's the truth. And if we try and have other people believe otherwise, we're in real deep trouble. There were a lot of people who believed otherwise. And this guy from Ohio, he was a senator, he tried, beginning in 1951, he put several possible amendment wordings forward. He said that would clarify the treaty-making power thing so that nobody could misunderstand. You can see here he was a senator, he was a governor of Ohio, and he was a Republican nominee for vice president in 1944. So this guy was very much involved in the service to the nation. The best Bricker Amendment that I could find, I say best because it was probably worded better than some of the others, because everything else got watered down over the years because, as we'll see in a minute, Eisenhower and his Secretary of State. This is the best one they had, which in my opinion is flawed. So don't think don't give the impression I'm suggesting that we take this and pass it now. This is weak in comparison to what the real truth is. He said in this proposed amendment, a provision of a treaty or other international agreement which conflicts with this Constitution or which is not made in pursuance thereof shall not be the supreme law of the land, nor be of any force or effect. Well, if they're pursuing something that was not in pursuance to something that's constitutional, well, there's a problem with that, but that's another discussion. So, but that failed to get the 2/3 vote in order for it to be sent forth to the states. And so it failed as a potential amendment. They tried it several other years, putting forth others to appease critics, and they watered it down, and they basically eviscerated it to the point that it became kind of a moot issue. All of them failed. All of those efforts did. Why? Two guys. Dwight Eisenhower, globalist to the core, and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. Some people probably know Eisenhower, but they do not know Dulles, nor his brother Allen. Allen was the CIA director during Eisenhower's administration. These two brothers that started back in Woodrow Wilson's reign of terror were around for a long time to cause problems. But let's look at Dulles for just a minute. All right, so he was associated with Edward Mandell House in the League of Nations effort. He was appointed legal counsel of the Versailles Treaty delegation. He was a very public supporter of Adolf Hitler. Nice guy. He was Thomas Dewey's chief foreign policy advisor when Dewey ran for president. He drafted the preamble to the United Nations. Oh, he wasn't a globalist, I can just tell you right now, without even looking at the preamble. If you don't get the sarcasm, sometimes somebody might read this incorrectly. He was the U.S. delegate to the United Nations in 1946, 47, and 1950. He was appointed a U.S. senator. He was Secretary of State in Eisenhower's administration, and he formulated both NATO and CETO, which we have talked about at some length. So these globalist regional arrangements under the United Nations were kind of his brainchild. It would bring the United States into war on behalf of other nations. Okay, so the Constitution can't be modified through the treaty process. It simply cannot be done. Here's something Jefferson said in regard to education. If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. If we're ignorant, we start believing, oh yeah, it says it in the Constitution, treaties are the supreme law of the land. I guess that's what it means. Anything they say goes. Yep, we changed it last time we wrote a treaty. I mean, if we're ignorant, we can't be free. By the way, Hosea and Isaiah agreed with that in principle. So here's what Jefferson said. I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society, but the people themselves, and if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education. This is the basis and process by which we're trying to do this. We bring these truths forth. People need to hear them, think about them, put them into their lives, and help them become popular. And Jefferson said, this is the true corrective of abuses of constitutional power. So we've got to become strict constructionists in the tradition of the Founding Fathers. Then we've got to hold our elected officials responsible for this. If they're not doing what's right, we've got to help educate them, and so they can keep their actions within those bounds that were established. Next portion of this area that we're reading about is that judges are bound to uphold the United States Constitution. Just the underlined portion of this says, the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. Okay, so judges are bound to uphold the Constitution, and even if some state writes some stupid idiot law, like maybe somebody like Illinois might, I don't know, I just picked a state, the judges in that state have a responsibility to uphold the United States Constitution. So there are states now that are modifying their constitutions. I think this is an overstatement, I know, and I'm being facetious, but I think California's constitution is about 2,972 pages long now. I'm kidding, okay? But you need to understand that they just keep throwing all sorts of whacked out things into their constitution, which cause greater and greater problems, okay? So, in areas of delegated authority, the Constitution is the supreme, and state constitutions and legislative enactments cannot override that. So did you hear that? In the areas it was delegated, no other constitution can override. If they start overriding stuff that's not, or they start enacting at the general government level, or they start acting like they have authority that was not delegated, then the states can intervene and modify and correct what they've done. Remember the 10th Amendment? If they didn't get the power, they don't have it. And the 9th Amendment says, even if we didn't mention rights, we've still got them, okay? So, some people say, oh, yeah, Bradley, oh, I know. But you've forgotten that elastic clause, that blasted clause that you just know, you never want to talk about that. Well, we're going to talk about it for a minute or two here. So-called elastic clause. It is not the elastic clause. That's a darned lie. It's not even a statistic. It is an absolute lie, okay? This so-called elastic clause does not ever allow the expansion of authority, the United States government and over under the United States Constitution. It does not allow it. We're going to look at it carefully. Basically, they call it the necessary proper clause. It's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, and it allows you to carry out the powers that are noted in the Constitution, both in Article 1, Section 8 and other constitutional authorities, to fulfill those responsibilities. We'll give you an example also. But first we'll read it. But this is not an elastic clause that allows expansion. It allows only the fulfillment of those powers. Here's what it actually says. The Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. The foregoing, so those are the ones were mentioned before. Okay, all right, got that. And all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any other department or officer thereof. So if there's some other place in the Constitution, like in Article 4 or something like that, where there's another power delegated within the Constitution, they can carry that out too. So it's called the necessary or proper, not the elastic clause, as those that would have us believe they can violate the Constitution by applying it. So it grants to Congress the necessary power to carry out the power that comes in the Constitution. Now, here's the example I wanted to show you. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5 delegates to the Congress the power to coin money. Okay? They don't tell you all the details. They just say, Congress shall have power to coin money. Okay? So, they carry out that by applying Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, that necessary and proper clause. So that includes the power to create or build a mint, the power to create job descriptions for the mint employees, the power to create employment requirements, the power to staff the mint, the power to pay the mint, the power to create and design the coins, and all those other things. Oh, that's the Coinage Act of 1792. Congress exercised that power when they did this, okay? When they created that Coinage Act. All those things came from that original power that says they'll have power to coin money, but the Clause 18 says they can carry out those powers too, and that's what they did. So they established gold and silver, and we could have a long discussion about gold and silver as the medium of exchange. A dollar is 371 1/4 grains of pure silver. Okay, and a grain is, the grain, where did that come from? It's a measurement of the weight of a grain of barley or wheat. It's a foodstuff. This is something everybody has in their back, well, not everybody now, but in the old days, they grew their wheat or their barley. So it ties ours back to the 371 1/4 grains is pure silver. Okay, we're going to see when they make a coin, they do it at a 90% rate. They put copper in there to harden it. Okay, so so this is called standard silver too. We're going to read that in just a minute. Okay, so here's the Coinage Act. We're not going to go through it all. I'm sure you'll be just dying to do so. But look at the fourth one down. It just defines what a dollar is. It's 371 1/4 grains of pure silver, or 416 grains of standard silver, so the 90% silver, okay? It does quarters and halves and dimes and all that kind of stuff. It defines all of these things based upon the power to coin money. If you look up coining money in the Webster 1828 dictionary, it has to do with stamping precious metals, okay? Why do they put copper in? It's to add a hardening. Because if you have pure silver or pure gold, it wears very easily. And so they need to harden it and make it so that it'll last when it's out in people's hands. Okay, so the Coinage Act established a mint. It defined the denomination, weights, and metal content. It established a proportional value of gold to silver, which, by the way, has changed over the years. 15 to 1, 15 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold initially. It changed in the first third of the 1800s to 20 to 1, and now it's almost 80 to 1. So just for those of you that are keeping track, my opinion is that silver is very much undervalued in relation to gold. In my opinion, silver is the poor man's gold or poor woman's gold, and someday there'll be an adjustment, I think, that brings it more into line with the traditional or historical values or proportional. But if that happens, silver is going to go up a whole bunch. Just a thought. And they ask, just in case somebody says, oh, but the death penalty is not a good thing, and you go back and read the Bill of Rights, this cruel and unusual punishment thing. These guys that put this together, along with the Bill of Rights, cruel and unusual punishment, said that if you are so bold as to pollute the financial system of the United States, we could put you to death. Okay, they were serious. Now this Federal Reserve thing and everything, I mean, we could talk about that at real length, about how they have absolutely polluted our economy with a false creation of money by a private, for-profit consortium of bankers. And it's completely debauched what the United States had in mind to begin with, but we don't have time to talk about that at this point. Okay, so they can carry out the powers granted, but they don't create additional or expanded powers, okay? Going back to James Madison, I, sir, have always conceived, I believe those that could propose the Constitution conceived it is still more fully known and more material to observe that those that ratified the Constitution conceived that it is not an indefinite government deriving its powers from the general terms of the prefix to the specific powers, but a limited government tied down to the specified powers which explain and define the general term. This government does not have any wiggle room in it. Again, Tucker said, written contract reduced to its elements, object was defined, principles ascertained, power limited and fixed. Okay, going on, Tucker went on to say, whenever therefore a question arises concerning the constitution of a particular power, the first question is whether the power be expressed in the Constitution. If it is, the question is decided. If it be not expressed, the next inquiry must be whether it is properly an incident to an expressed power, and necessary to its execution, like that power to coin money. Okay, it doesn't tell you how you're going to do it, but we can make a law about that. Okay. If it be, it may be exercised by Congress. If it not, Congress cannot exercise it. This construction of the necessary and proper is not only consonant with that which prevailed during the discussions and ratification of the Constitution, but is absolutely necessary to maintain their consistency with the peculiar nature of the government as possessed of a particular and defined powers only, and not the general indefinite powers vested in ordinary governments. So he's saying, yeah, we admit other governments might say, go out and do stuff that looks like this. No, we were very specific in what we said we could do. Let's talk about the oath of office for a minute. So everybody has to take an oath of office. Senators, before mentioned, state legislatures, executive judicial officers, United States, several states, bound by oath or affirmation to support the Constitution. They were serious about this. Let's look about how we define the oath, all the officers, and how they created them just momentarily. And the president has a specific oath. Every one of those others are legislatively created. We know that the Americanist principles talk about separation of powers and the specified of those powers. The Constitution's written, the meanings can be known of the words. They're listed, enumerated, and there are checks and balances between the departments. All of these kind of things are clearly defined within the Constitution. So it's written, words have meaning, meanings can be known. They can only mean what they were meant when they were written. You can't say, I know it says republics, but democracies now are really like that in the way they're defined, and so we're going to say it's a democracy. No. You use the word, you look at the definition that was used in its terminology in the day, you can't change it over time. Okay, so if we don't follow these very strictly, we're going to lose our Charter of Liberty. Noah Webster defined a constitution as paramount. We're going to define paramount in a minute. To the statutes or laws enacted by the legislature limiting and controlling its power. So what is paramount? It means it's superior, it's eminent, of the highest order. It's the chief, highest rank order. The Constitution is over all the other things that could be created legislatively. So this oath thing, Webster defined it. A solemn affirmation or declaration made with an appeal to God for the truth of what is affirmed. Now, wait a minute, do they all end in, so help me God? No, they don't. But Webster's position was, if you're taking an oath, it's before God, whether you say it or not. The appeal to God in an oath implies that the person imprecates, they invite, his vengeance and renounces his favor if the declaration is false, or if the declaration is a promise, the person invokes the vengeance of God if he should fail to fulfill it. A false oath is called perjury. That's how seriously they looked upon oaths in the founding era. Nowadays, everybody crosses their fingers behind their back before they raise their hand to the square, whatever. Okay, so the president has a specific oath. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Very simple, straightforward, tying them to that document that is the contract they have with America. Newt Gingrich's contract had nothing to do with it. It's all a falsehood. Your contract with America when you become an officer in the nation is to uphold the Constitution. So this requires that everybody take one, as we've read in Article 6, Clause 3. And the first law, this is how serious it was. The first law that was passed by the first Congress in 1789, after it was constituted, when it came together, all of that was happening, they put this simple oath in the law because it was required under the Constitution. I do solemnly swear or affirm, as the case may be, that I will support the Constitution of the United States. Pretty straightforward. That was the first law that was passed under the new Constitution. This is one that came in after the Civil War, that they will support and defend the Constitution. This is everybody. And bear true allegiance and faith and take an obligation freely and everything else like that. So help me God. They put it at the end of that one in 1884. Title 5 U.S. Code Sections 3331. This is what they take as an oath of office. I guess you don't need to read them all. I mean, I don't need to read them to you. The fact of the matter is that this is ubiquitous in all the service opportunities and obligations within the United States government. The United States Senate, remember the House and the Senate write their own rules constitutionally? You remember that, I'm sure. Okay, so Rule 3 says that here's the oath the senators have to take. And so they have a specific oath that they're all very essentially the same thing, but every office has an oath that's associated with it. So help me God is in this senator thing too. Civilian that works for the federal government takes this oath. All of these are, I think, evidence of the importance of these oaths and how they should be exercised with the utmost of care. Alexis de Tocqueville came to the United States, first third of the 1800s, boots on the ground to see what the country was about. He was going to look at their prison systems and some of these things, but he went out and saw a lot of things. And Tocqueville went back and wrote about it in France. And he makes a comment about something he saw in the courts in New York. He says, whilst I was in America, a witness who happened to be called at the assize, that's a court of justice, of the county of Chester in the state of New York, declared that he did not believe in the existence of God or in the immortality of the soul. The judge refused to admit his evidence on the ground that the witness had destroyed beforehand all the confidence of the court in what he was about to say. Newspapers wrote about it, didn't have a comment. See, everybody says, you know what, if you don't believe in God, you don't think you're going to ever be punished for lying to us, we can't even trust you to, testify. That was just the way it was. That's the way we did business. Here's a military oath, and I wish we had more time. It's different than when I joined 55 years ago. And there's some orders of precedence, I think, that I could point out and defend. But there is an oath if you go in the military, okay? So at every level, Constitution's paramount. You take an oath to uphold that. It's of the highest order. And when you are in an office, you cannot redelegate your authority. We've read about this before, and we have John Locke in here stating the fact that you cannot redelegate an authority that's given. The legislature, Article 1, Section 1 says, all legislative authority herein granted is held by who? House and the Senate. They can't say, you guys, here, President, take this and do a treaty and we delegate to you the authority. No. Nobody can delegate. Nobody can assume. They can't say, well, we're creating a law that creates the IRS or the BATFE or the FDA or whomever. They will make laws, regulations, and policies. They don't call them laws. Sometimes say, well, they're not really a law, but they're enforced against us as though they were. Walks like a duck, talks like a duck, You can't, Congress cannot say we're delegating some of our authority to create laws that will be enacted and carried out against American citizens to some other alphabet soup organization. Cannot be done. That was constitutional protocol. And so, again, the Federalist 45, we've reviewed that plenty of times, knowing that the Constitution has very few and defined powers. Okay? The states retain with the people the rest. Again, the men who proposed the Constitution conceived as more fully known and more material to observe that those who ratified the Constitution conceived that this is not an indefinite government, deriving its powers from the general terms prefixed to the specified powers, but a limited government tied down to the specified powers which explain and define the general terms. It is a written contract. The elements are there, objects defined, principles ascertained, powers limited and fixed. Okay, now I'm just going to run a few slides here. And our time has really expired. I've not completed everything we've got, but the general gist of some of these things. Maybe we ought to talk about this before we wrap it up. I could probably wrap it up by going 15 minutes over. What do you think, Enoch? Beyond the end time? Oh, it's a democracy now. Okay. I thought you were going to make a Yes.
I think you're that representative, aren't you? You're running this show.
Go a little over? All right. And These Kentucky resolutions were essential to understanding limits and bounds. We're going to have a few slides about this. Again, Jefferson and Madison collaborated on this. Go read them again yourself, carefully. This is a capture of what the limits and bounds of the nation's government were, that the several states composing the United States of America are not united on the principle of unlimited submission to their general government, but that by a compact, again a contract, under the style and title of a Constitution for the United States and of amendments thereto, they constituted a general government for special purposes, delegated to that government certain definite powers, reserving each state to itself the residuary mass of right to their own self-government, and that whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. Going on. The government created by this compact was not made the exclusive or final judge of the extent of the powers delegated to itself. Now think about that for a minute. If the general government now has the power to say, oh, this falls under our power. No, that isn't what happened. They can't judge it. They can only fulfill their obligation to carry it out. Okay, they can't be the exclusive or final judge of the extent of the powers delegated to itself, since that would have made its discretion and not the Constitution the measure of its powers. But that as in all the cases of compact among powers, having no common judge, each party has an equal right to judge for itself, as well of infractions as of the mode and measure of redress. Think about this for a second. The states were the makers of the contract. The general government was the creature of the contract. The creature cannot come more than it is delegated. And if it starts to usurp, the states, as creators of the contract, have a right to re-intervene. This is the whole basis of nullification, and on all levels. So we just need to think that. Remember, the 10th Amendment says if we didn't give you the power, you don't have it. The 9th Amendment says we retained all rights, and these things can't be given away just because we ignored them. Going on with the Kentucky resolutions, it would be a dangerous delusion were a confidence in the men of our choice to silence our fears for the safety of our rights. Confidence in the men of our choices. We elected them. We got to trust them. No. This is based upon a lot of resistance, in fact, in many cases. You'll read about it here in just a second. Men of our choice to silence our fears for the safety of our rights. Confidence is everywhere the parent of despotism. Free government is founded in jealousy and not in confidence. It is jealousy and not confidence which prescribes limited constitutions to bind down those whom we are obligated to trust with power. We have always got to be watching. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, so said Andy Jackson in his farewell address. Going on with the resolutions, our Constitution has accordingly fixed the limit to which and no further our confidence may go. In questions of power, then, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. The Constitution is the limit and bounds, and we, the people, need to understand what that is. This was a stupid statement in a lot of ways by Teddy Roosevelt, because at the end of it, he makes a kind of attempt to clarify and maybe even disarm us into thinking he was a better president than he was. He was a progressive. He was a socialist. He should not be on Mount Rushmore, in my opinion. Neither should Lincoln. But at any rate, that's another discussion. But the fact of the matter is, Teddy Roosevelt was a concession to the socialists of his day. And he says, patriotism means to stand by the country. It does not mean to stand by the president or any other public official, save exactly to the degree in which he himself stands by the country. Well, anybody can get up and say, I'm standing with the country. You've got to have a standard by which you can measure that. That's where his statement is flawed. It is unpatriotic not to oppose him to the exact extent that by inefficiency or otherwise, inefficiency, that's one of the least of the sins, I would say. A lot of people boldly go, well, no man has gone before to destroy our liberty. And he's saying, oh, if he's inefficient, oh, he fails in his duty to stand by the country. Every man who parrots the cry, stand by the president without adding the proviso, so far as he serves the republic, is wrong. Okay, so he has some things that are right there, but we must measure it in the proper scale. That's the Constitution. The basis of it has got to be, in the plain English words, using the plain definitions that were there to begin with. If we don't, we can be misled very quickly. Religious test prohibition, you can't have a religious test to judge the qualifications of an individual to hold the office. They particularly got rid of that. It's interesting to note that when the Constitution was adopted, there were 7 states that had, now these are pretty widely defined state religions, but 7 states had state religions. They didn't try to get rid of that, but they said you can't use, let's say Massachusetts, you can't use on your ballot a thing that says, are you a member of the Congregational Church? If you're going to hold office. You can't have that kind of test. Something as broad as the Christian faith or the Protestant faith, all of these things are, by the way, Virginia would have been on here if there had not been something happened that we'll talk about briefly here. Virginia had a state religion that they disenfranchised, if you will, based upon their Religious Liberties Act. But in spite of the fact these states had state religions, they could not impose them upon anybody to run for office. Okay, so the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom is about freedom of conscience, separation of church and state from the perspective of not having state driven or being driven by religion in any way. It's a forerunner of the First Amendment. It came out in 1786. It was written by Thomas Jefferson, and it is embodied in the First Amendment. It disestablished the Church of England in Virginia in 1786, which was before the Constitution was written. Everybody had religious freedom. Jefferson wrote it. And this is, I'm going to have 2 little slides, I think, on this that make some points that you're going to need to think about without me dwelling on them. This is what was written into that act. Be it enacted by General Assembly that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods. So you can't tax a person based upon which church you're involved in. Nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. So he's saying, just because you don't believe in the state religion or some big deal doesn't mean you can't serve in a civil capacity. And though this is an important thing, legislators cannot bind a future legislature. That is done by a constitution, okay? So he's saying we passed this law that everybody has religious liberty. We know we can't bind the future legislature of Virginia, but if they ever get rid of this law, know that they're violating natural law. We'll read these things. We well know that this assembly, elected by the people for the ordinary purposes of legislation only, have no power to restrain the acts of succeeding assemblies constituted with powers equal to our own, and that therefore to declare this act irrevocable would be of no effect in the law. Yet we are free to declare, and do declare, that the rights hereby asserted are of the natural rights of mankind, and that if any act shall hereafter be passed to repeal or present the present or narrow its operation, such act will be an infringement on natural right. So they're saying, we know you can deep six this if you want, but if you do, the people need to know you violated a natural right. Everybody should be able to worship according to the dictates of their conscience. There were a few things that Jefferson wanted to be remembered for. Here's a copy of his tombstone. You probably can't read it, and I'll give you in a little more clear writing. It says who's buried there. He was pretty pleased with the fact that he authored the Declaration of Independence, the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and he was the father of the University of Virginia. Those were the 3 things that he felt pretty good about. And then as we are here, you need to understand that declaring religious faith shall be unpunished does not give impunity to criminal acts dictated by religious error. This is a letter to James Madison. And basically it says, no, honor killings are not allowed. Okay, you can't do that in religion and say, well, I can kill my daughter for dating an infidel. Okay, I can run over my wife, if whatever. No. So criminal acts are still criminal. And this is important when we find things that are happening in the nation that are being sought to be carried out in the name of Sharia law or something like that in the future. So our founding fathers were religious. Many were ministers. They were committed to their religion, but they were also devoted to liberty. Okay. So they wanted everybody to worship according to the dictates of their conscience. No religious test. Again, I've found myself excluded from office, or at least being on the ballot, in some states that wanted to do a religious test because I wasn't Christian enough, according to their belief system. Okay. Anyway, Washington talked about our common heritage. He said, with slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. The people was pretty homogenous in their belief system. And we really were one nation under God. They talk about the ratification of the Constitution here in these ending articles. And they're going to have 9 states that ratify it. And it will become effective. If you can't get 9, the Constitution doesn't go into effect of anybody. If you get 9, it will be for those that ratified it. They were not going to impose it on the rest of them. Remember, there were only 13 states at that time. The 4 other states, they could go wherever they wanted. And Rhode Island basically kind of did for a while until they decided they were going to treat them as a foreign nation. And they said, oh, wait, we'll ratify it too. But see, this was far different than what had happened with the Articles of Confederation when they were first brought out after the Declaration of Independence. So let's just quickly hit that. We're just about done. So in July, they did the Declaration of Independence, and then they appointed a committee to put together a constitution. See, these were men that understood the basis of how government was to be established. They weren't wild-eyed radicals who wanted to burn the country down, go home, watch it on CNN or something like that. They wanted to say, this is what it takes to be a nation, and a constitution was one of them. So July 12th, the ink wasn't even hard to dry on the Declaration. Well, it wasn't really dry because some of them didn't sign it until August, but that's another story. But so they got a committee together to draft these Articles of Confederation, a constitution. They presented them on the 12th of July to the Congress, and Congress adopted them the 15th of November after they had hammered them. Okay, they didn't become operative until all the individual states had ratified them. They had a requirement, unlike the new Constitution, which said 9 states will apply it. You other guys can go do what you want. It said that we got to have everybody on board with this. So Maryland was the last one that ratified it in March of 1781. You might remember that Yorktown happened not long after that. So, I mean, we almost lost the Revolutionary War under the Articles. They acted like they were ratified, but they weren't. But it took them all that time to get all 13 states on board. But then they had this little article in the Articles of Confederation that they couldn't change any of the articles unless 100% of the states agreed. So all 13 of the states had to say, thumbs up, we're going with this, we're going to amend these. It made it almost impossible to change anything. There was some other things that were involved in that about admitting other states and things like that were in there too that made it difficult. But see, they had learned from this process the challenges. These things got superseded in 1789, and then they signed it and said, this is done in convention, unanimous consent of the states present, 17th day of September in the year of our Lord, whoops, let's get down there, 1787, of the independence of the United States of America, the 12th, and the witness thereof, we hereafter unto subscribe our names. And the guys signed it that were there. So there we have those measly little Articles 6 and 7 in the Constitution. So many of the things that are going on in the nation today, this idea about treaties, this idea about debt, the things that have to do with the foundational principles of our liberty are under stress because we basically don't understand the background of these last couple of articles. So with that, we'll close, and I did bring it 3 minutes earlier than I said, and I asked for my extended time, and we're done now. And Enoch, if you want to come out and take control of this meeting again, which you lost control of so long ago, we will heretofore go forward.
Okay, thank you so much.
You've got an overhead noise.
Yeah, now that sounds louder.
Yes, it does.
So our mics were set differently. And we can do a couple questions as well if we want to do that still. But I just had some notes as I'm listening to Scott, thinking about some of the things he said. He really painted a picture of global regionalism, right? How that has expanded and how that has really messed with the independence of all these different nations. And that's been happening for a very long time in these world wars. And so when you think about today, we can see the effect that has had on the world. That should really alarm us to see regionalism creeping inward into our nation, right? And all these, the things that I've been saying for the last few years about regionalism and even just this, this high density happening in small towns and everywhere, it's largely the regional governments that are funding those or creating the grant programs, right? And so I said something in one of my presentations where I called regionalism the United Nations invasion. But when you see the global regionalism and how that's NATO and see all these wars, you see the operation of the United Nations. And so you can identify that principle coming inwardly to us. So one point Scott really made is how our ignorance is what allows that, right? If people knew, if just there's a general knowledge about being involved in foreign wars and why that was wrong, they wouldn't happen. More people would just refuse to go. You can definitely bet in the founders' time, if they tried to call us, to go fight in Europe, it would have been a joke, right? Yeah. So Scott always says this, the words are written down, they have meaning. We have to know those words, and then we have to hold officials responsible. Well, to hold the officials responsible, it's an individual thing, but then it's harder to do on our own. And so you can unite with your neighbors, and when you learn the Constitution, you learn the words, and you have a right to associate with your neighbors and petition for redress and instruct your representatives and hold them accountable. And that's what our manual and our instruction and mentorship that we give is all about, is how to formally do that so that you're not alone. How everyone, anywhere, wherever you are in the state or in the country, you can associate with your neighbors and learn to enforce the Constitution at the local level. So anyway, and that's what the committees are all about. Just plug that for the online people there too. Does anyone want to ask questions related to the content that we can have Scott answer? We can probably have a few questions. He's okay, bad timing. Okay, well, does anyone have questions? We can just, yes. Okay, yeah. So the question is, how is it that federal bureaucracy can force us to wear masks and to get medical treatment and all that? They can't legally, lawfully, right? We've clarified that. But who enforces the Constitution? The knowledge of the people, the understanding. One of the greatest things that we focused on in 2020 was reminding the people that the executive branch can't write law. And I think that was actually a reminder, and it felt new to a lot of people because we just didn't think about that for so long, right? So fundamentally, they can't, but they will when we let them, right? Usurpation will happen naturally unless we stop it, right? Yeah, go ahead. Hey, let me give you a mic for the people online.
I have a question and a comment. So question, I just went to Hamilton last week,
Mm.
and they portray Jefferson as wanting to go over and support the French Revolution.
Mm.
And of course, that Hamilton is based on a book. I don't know which book, but any comment on that?
Yeah, if you want to comment on that, you can. I have my opinion on that, but we'll let Scott do that.
Maybe I ought to let you talk first, and then I'll be quiet. The most of the Broadway plays nowadays are very much theatrical entertainment that have very little to do with accurate historical perspective. And that's the nicest thing I can say about many of them. Hamilton was an interesting character that he was one of the people that most of the scandalous things that have ever been said or done about most politicians apply to him. And his adulterous situation and his destroying the U.S. economy and all those kind of things are pretty much cheered today. So if you like the entertainment, that's fine, but keep it in mind. But just so you understand that Jefferson initially was very much in favor of the French Revolution. He had spent much time there as the ambassador to France. He was in love with all things French, the culture, the cuisine, I mean, everything. But he was excited about the French Revolution, thinking and hoping that it was a manifestation that liberty was going to spread to Europe. And he initially was very excited about it. And Edmund Burke was a diplomat in England that saw it otherwise and was accurate in his assessment that it would lead to tyranny. And he kind of locked horns with Jefferson initially. And Jefferson was quite angry about it, for Burke to be so harsh on his assessment of where the French Revolution was going. Burke wrote a very large, it's over 100 pages if I recall correctly, letter exposing the debauchery that would probably come about because of the French Revolution and its Illuminist, Illuminati, Rousseau origins. And Jefferson repented quickly of that and got in line with it. And it's interesting to note that when Washington was president and Jefferson was his Secretary of State, a guy by the name of Jeannette, Edmund Jeannette, came here as a French ambassador. And he landed down in the South and he started outfitting ships to go and fight on behalf of the French in their latest war with the English. And Jefferson and Washington were absolutely livid about this, and they were very vocal in their denunciations of this thing. And Jeannette went about starting Democratic Republican clubs, if you will, as he meandered his way up to see Jefferson in Washington. Well, they were also denounced, and so this is an understanding. The Democratic Republican Party did not originate with Jefferson or his people. It was denounced, and this French connection for the latest war with the English was denounced. And so what you got in the Hamilton thing was a real kind of a, shall we say, truncated view of what the truth is. and Jefferson was in favor of liberty, hoped for that with the French, but he saw the folly of it soon and he sickened of it. And he actually had to intervene to save the guy that wrote Common Sense. What was his name? Thomas Paine?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you quote Thomas Paine, be careful. Thomas Paine was a revolutionary, and he got his big mouth in trouble a lot of times, and he had to he almost lost his head in France. And by the intervention of Jefferson was able to be saved. But the fact of the matter is that most of these Broadway plays and so on are basically fabrications of somebody's entertainment gene.
Well, I agree. I totally agree with you. I do feel like Hamilton at least got another level of, another generation, at least considering American history because it's been totally left out of schools. But the one comment I wanted to make, Scott, that I got out of your presentation that was really profound was the Article 5, okay? Because that has been used as a proactive way to change the Constitution, where tonight what I saw it as being a defense mechanism to protect the Constitution from being overridden, of being, as you explained, through treaties, you know, and having treaties that would supersede the Constitution. That I'm looking at Article 5 now more as a defense mechanism instead of how it's been used as an offensive to try to fix the Constitution. It doesn't need fixing. No, so because I'm like, well, why do we have why do we have Article 5 sitting there if we're not ever using it? And it's there to protect the Constitution.
Well, it is it is there to preserve the right of the people to change their government in a means that is not violent. And the process that's currently being used is an effort to rewrite it. And of course, last time we met together and we talked about the Article 5, the vast majority of the suggested things that people would like to do with the convention is a return to the Articles of Confederation, which were absolutely a failure formula and absolutely unequivocally were rejected by the American founding fathers for good and valid reasons that they understood and we rarely do now. And so consequently, the people that are trying to do it are trying to retro the United States back into a failure formula that somehow will get their fingerprints on it. Enoch, maybe you want to talk about the French thing too, I don't know.
Yeah, my brain goes on 100 tangents as we talk. It's like, which one do I jump on? The Articles of Confederation thing, I think I've seen it a lot where people are tempted to say, well, the Constitution doesn't seem to be working, maybe because we'll try the Articles of Confederation again, right? But all of this is just a misunderstanding of history, taking history in little pieces, bite-sized pieces out of context. When one of the greatest things I learned from Scott is in the Articles of Confederation, showing it's a learning process. We tried this, and here's the documented reason why it failed. Like they were all for some of the arguments initially that you hear for the Articles of Confederation, and then, 11 years we lived under it, and here's the problems we had. So I think that's, we learn from history there. And any other questions? Are there any questions online, Julia? Okay, well then, the founders? Are you talking about the founders did? The founders did not make an assumption that we all have the same culture. They knew we had a different culture. Even back then, with all of the different Christian religions, there were different cultures. Their view was that there were just the basic elements that all religions of the world had in common. Sure. But I mean, that's not the point. Is not to label a religion, because you'll probably get all different stripes of that too, where people, in their own way, everyone has a right to believe. You can't really judge someone on the beliefs. You judge them by the actions they take at the end of the day, because the actions are a testament to what their beliefs internally really are. And so their view was that the United States could be united on a culture under God, while they recognized there were a lot of problems in all the different churches. The religious wars in England, they remembered that history. It was very bloody. They remembered the colonists in deciding that if you weren't predestined by God under a certain religion than you can rule in some of the early colonies. There are all kinds of examples, even just among the Christian denominations. So they said, how do we get united? Because they knew a country that was united under one church tended to have some unity. And so they recognized America's unity was, we believe in a God. There's a quote, I think it's Benjamin Franklin, I don't know, Scott, if you remember that, but I have it in one of my other presentations, right? We believe that there's a God and we're accountable to an afterlife, so we'll govern our own behavior. And you find that as a universal philosophy of even people who aren't in religion that sort of just think everyone's figuring out religion on their own. That's the nature of this world in many ways, right? People hop from church to church, but we all kind of feel like generally there's an accountability to something, I think. Now, is there a minimal exception? Sure, the New York example, right? Some guy just declares, I don't believe in it. And it's like, well, how do we even know you'll honor your words to anybody, right? You think you can buy with impunity. So, yeah, that's kind of my thought there. I think the founders had a real good view on that. Okay, well, thank you then. We run late. Thank you guys for sticking around. And it's a lot of fun to have you guys. And we'll just dismiss you for the evening. Thank you.
Recording stopped.